New York did not simply grow, it roared, devoured, and resurrected itself every night. By the time the 1920s bled into the early 1930s, the city had become a living organism built on contradiction. Neon lights gleamed above alleys where blood dried on the bricks. Jazz floated through smoky speakeasies while footsteps echoed in backstreets where men whispered promises they never intended to keep. For immigrants chasing survival, the American dream was a coin that flipped between opportunity and death. And in this volatile world, one man learned to control both the coin and the hand that flipped it. Into this city of noise and ambition stepped Salvatore Lucky Luciano, an unassuming figure at first glance, slight, sharp-featured, a man who walked with the calm arrogance of someone who understood that fear, when used correctly, was more persuasive than any gun. He didn't rule with theatrics. He ruled with precision. In an era when power was measured in territory and loyalty was bought with violence, Luciano saw something different. A system waiting to be reorganized, modernized, disciplined. He saw an empire where others only saw chaos. But before the empire, before the commission, before newspapers printed his name in bold accusation, there was simply a young man navigating a world where survival meant adapting quickly and leaving emotion at the door. Crime in New York was a storm, swirling with rival gangs and stubborn old-world bosses who clung to outdated traditions. Every corner was claimed by someone, every racket taxed by someone else. Bloodshed was not an exception, it was routine. Something had to change. Someone had to change it. This is where our story begins, not with the legend but with the environment that forged the legend. The city was fractured, divided among Italian, Jewish, and Irish criminal factions, each fighting for slivers of control. The Prohibition era had turned illegal liquor into gold, and those who handled it grew rich overnight. But with wealth came conflict. With conflict came bodies. And with bodies came opportunity for anyone bold enough to seize it. Luciano watched this world with predator-like clarity. Where others reacted, he planned. Where others demanded obedience through brute force, he offered structure. Where others held grudges shaped by Sicilian tradition, he formed alliances unthinkable to the older generation. At night, the city's glow revealed 1,000 secrets. In dimly lit backrooms, deals were struck over cigarette smoke and half-truths. The police were either outnumbered or in someone's pocket. Politicians spoke loudly about reform, but whispered quietly when a familiar envelope slid across their desk. It was a time when fear held more authority than law, and Luciano recognized that if he could command fear, not through recklessness but through intelligent organization, he could reshape the very foundation of organized crime. Yet power in New York was never freely given. It required vision, yes, but also ruthlessness. Luciano would become famous for both. His name would drift through every borough, carried on the breath of gamblers, laborers, bootleggers, and dancers. Some spoke it with respect, others with terror, many with awe. But almost all recognized the truth. The rules were changing and he was the one changing them. People often imagine that criminal empires are built in moments of explosive violence, but Luciano's rise was defined by subtlety, small decisions that shifted the balance of power. An alliance here, a quiet elimination there, a strategic betrayal concealed beneath a handshake. He understood that fear, to be effective, needed to be predictable. Not wild. Not random. And so he crafted a criminal world where violence had purpose, hierarchy had meaning, and chaos was replaced by order. But before the order there must be the unraveling. Before the rise, there must be the tension building beneath the surface. The city was ready for a revolution it did not see coming. As crime families fought over scraps of territory, as aging bosses clung to dying systems, as young gangsters looked for leadership that could actually deliver the future they dreamed of, Luciano positioned himself quietly, confidently, patiently. History would remember him as the architect of modern organized crime, the man who transformed the Mafia from a series of feuding clans into a national syndicate. But the beginning of this transformation is not found in a courtroom or a council meeting. It is found here, in the heartbeat of New York, where ambition and desperation collided every second. It is found in the shadows where Luciano learned that power was not inherited but built, piece by calculated piece. This story is not just about crime. It is about psychology, how fear can become law, how loyalty can be engineered, and how one man understood that true control comes from designing a system where others willingly follow. As the city burned with opportunity and danger, Luciano stepped forward, not as a hero or a villain, but as a strategist shaped by the world around him. The city was ready for him. It just didn't know it yet. New York before Luciano was a battleground pretending to be a city. Long before his name echoed through the underworld, The streets were carved into invisible borders by men who believed tradition was more powerful than evolution. The criminal world was dominated by the mustache Petes, old-world Sicilian bosses who ran their operations with stubborn pride and an unbending loyalty to customs brought from villages thousands of miles away. They didn't trust outsiders, especially not Jews, Irish, or younger Italians who embraced America's fast-changing landscape. Their rule was rigid, slow, and deeply rooted in personal grudges. And in a country accelerating at the speed of cars, jazz, and skyscrapers, the old ways were beginning to crack. Every neighborhood was a kingdom of its own. In East Harlem, the Morello family operated a counterfeiting empire. In Lower Manhattan, the Neapolitans fought for scraps against rival Sicilian factions. Brooklyn was a maze of Irish gangs controlling docks and union rackets, while Jewish bootleggers dominated the liquor pipelines fed by Prohibition. These groups did not coexist, they collided. Every week brought news of another shooting, another body in a gutter, another boss eliminated by someone hungrier. The Mafia in America was not a unified structure but a patchwork of volatile clans. There was no central authority, no system of arbitration, no code beyond personal vendetta. Prohibition intensified everything. When alcohol became illegal, the black market exploded. Barrels of whiskey were worth more than gold, and the men who controlled those barrels became targets. Speakeasies sprouted across Manhattan like weeds, hidden bars disguised behind barber shops, bakeries, and tailor shops. Behind every locked door, someone made money and someone else plotted to take it. Bootlegging routes were hijacked, trucks were ambushed, shipments vanished into the night. Law enforcement was overwhelmed, underfunded, and often on the payroll of whoever paid the most. Corruption didn't grow during Prohibition, it flourished. Yet for all the money flowing through the streets, the criminal underworld had no structure to match its potential. The older bosses viewed business through the lens of personal honor. If one man insulted another, blood spilled. If someone crossed a border, intentionally or not, war erupted. Alliances formed and shattered with terrifying speed. The idea of cooperation among different ethnic groups was unthinkable. The Sicilians despised the Neapolitans distrusted the Calabrians, and all of them distrusted anyone who wasn't Italian. In this environment, deals were fragile and egos were deadly. It was a world where the past ruled over the present. Many mustache Petes refused to touch drug trafficking because it violated old Sicilian codes. They rejected partnerships with Jewish gangsters even though Jewish syndicates had immense financial reach. They dismissed the younger generation as impetuous dreamers, refusing to accept that America required a different style of leadership. Beneath their rigid order lay a core weakness, the inability to adapt. And in the criminal world, stagnation is the first sign of death. Violence became the language of negotiation. When disagreements couldn't be settled through words, and they rarely could, men like Joe Masuria or Salvatore Maranzano deployed soldiers to settle the score. The city braced for more bodies every time rumors of a meeting surfaced. Newspapers turned these wars into daily entertainment. Headlines screamed of barbershop massacres and midday slayings, feeding the public's dark fascination while exposing the Mafia's internal chaos to wider scrutiny. The police responded with crackdowns, but each crackdown only created new opportunities for someone smarter to rise. Young gangsters watching all this noticed one glaring flaw. The old bosses were too focused on being kings of small, dying territories. They fought over neighborhoods when the entire city, and eventually the entire nation, was ripe for organized control. Younger minds, including future architects of the new Mafia, began to see that the old model was unsustainable. Crime was becoming big business, and big business required order, not constant warfare. It needed structure, not superstition. And most of all, it needed leadership that understood the reality of America, not the traditions of Sicily. As the wars escalated, the city felt the pressure. Ordinary citizens lived with the echoes of gunshots as casually as the sound of passing trains. Store owners paid protection money because refusing meant destruction. Unions were battlegrounds where workers walked in fear of who controlled their leaders. Politicians, desperate to maintain influence, aligned themselves with whichever boss seemed strongest at the moment. New York's underworld didn't operate in the shadows, it bled into every corner of life. Into this volatile environment stepped a generation of ambitious young gangsters. Men who understood that power could not be maintained through constant bloodshed. Among them was Lucky Luciano, who watched the chaos with sharp eyes and a mind thinking far ahead of everyone else. He saw that the old bosses were guarding a system already collapsing under its own weight. The wars had become predictable, wasteful, and costly. Prohibition had opened a door to unprecedented wealth, but the Mafia was too fractured to exploit it fully. Luciano understood something the Mustache Pete's never would. If the Mafia remained divided, it would tear itself apart. But if someone unified it, modernized it, and turned it into a business, it could dominate the American landscape for generations. New York before Luciano was not just a city in conflict. It was a system begging for reorganization. A world where tradition fought desperately against transformation. A place where every street corner hinted at opportunity, but only for someone bold enough to take it, reshape it, and impose a new order. The stage was set. The old world was weakening. And the man who would rebuild the underworld into a national empire was quietly preparing for his moment. The fractures in the criminal world were not weaknesses, they were openings. And Lucky Luciano would turn those openings into a revolution. He was born Salvatore Lucania in 1897, in a small Sicilian village where life was predictable, poor, and ruled by honor codes older than memory. Sicily was a land shaped by hardship, dusty roads, strict fathers, and a silence that taught boys to swallow fear before they learned to speak. But when the Lucania family boarded a ship for America, they carried a fragile hope that the new world would offer opportunities their homeland never could. What they didn't know was that the boy stepping onto the docks of New York at age 9 would grow into one of the most influential criminal architects in American history. On the Lower East Side, the American dream looked very different from the postcards. Tenements were stacked like prison blocks, windows cracked, alleys overflowing with trash, children playing stickball between horse manure and broken bottles. Families lived 5 to a room, mothers worked in sweatshops for pennies, fathers labored endlessly just to keep food on the table. Poverty wasn't just a condition, it was an enemy. And young Salvatore understood early that if he didn't fight it, it would swallow him. The streets became his first classroom. On Broome Street the rules were simple: be tough, be quick, and trust no one. Boys formed small gangs not out of choice but necessity. They walked to school in groups not because of friendship, but because walking alone was an invitation to be robbed or beaten. Fights broke out for shoes, for food, for pride. These weren't playground scuffles, they were survival drills. Luciano learned to protect himself with fists first, words later. Pain didn't frighten him, it educated him. By the age of 10 he was already running errands for neighborhood gangs, delivering packages, passing messages, keeping watch. He noticed how the older boys dressed better, walked with confidence, carried respect that adults seemed too exhausted to command. That respect impressed him more than any school lesson. The teachers spoke of discipline and the future. The streets spoke of power and the present. The streets won. His first breakthrough came from a simple gamble. At 15, Luciano realized he could make small money charging younger kids for protection from the very bullies he secretly controlled. It was crude, but it was his earliest form of management. A system, a service, and a profit. Years later he would build empires using the same principles. Control the threat, control the solution, control the profit. But back then it was just a kid's hustle. A hustle that made more sense than anything written in textbooks. It was around this time that he dropped out of school. Formal education had nothing to offer him compared to what he learned on the streets. There, he discovered strategy, not just violence. He learned how to read people, the liars, the weak, the proud, the reckless. He learned how to negotiate, how to intimidate without appearing hostile, how to stay calm while others panicked. While other boys dreamed of becoming policemen, soldiers, or laborers, Luciano dreamed of control, real, tangible control over his environment. But ambition alone doesn't build legends. Fate too played its part. One night, while walking home from a card game, Luciano was grabbed by a group of rivals, beaten savagely, stabbed, and left for dead on the docks. The attackers believed he wouldn't survive the night. But he did. Barely. The doctors called it miraculous. His friends called it luck. And the name Lucky stuck. Some believed it symbolized divine protection. Others said it was pure fear. After all, a man who survives a brutal assassination attempt earns an aura that no nickname can fully explain. Luciano never corrected anyone. People wanted to believe he was blessed by fate, he let them. Fear, respect, and myth often grew from the same seed. The attack didn't weaken him, it sharpened him. He returned to the streets colder, clearer, more calculating. The boy who once fought to survive now learned to fight to advance. His circle widened to include sharp minds like Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel. Lansky recognized in Luciano a rare combination, a gangster who could think like a businessman. Siegel admired his courage and calmness under pressure. Together, they formed an alliance that transcended ethnicity, a revolutionary concept at a time when Italians, Jews, and Irish rarely cooperated. But Luciano didn't seek partners based on heritage. He sought them based on usefulness. He believed loyalty came from mutual benefit, not shared blood. This philosophy put him at odds with the old-world Sicilian bosses, but it also made him stand out in a world where tradition choked innovation. His early ventures included bootlegging, gambling, extortion, and small-time rackets. Some ventures failed. Some flourished. But each one taught him something essential about the business of crime. Where money flowed, power followed. And where power grew, enemies multiplied. He learned to predict betrayal long before it reached him, to suppress emotion when making decisions, and to maintain a calm exterior even when surrounded by danger. By his early 20s, Luciano had already built a reputation. He wasn't the most violent. He wasn't the loudest. He wasn't the flashiest. But he was the smartest man in every room he entered. Older gangsters underestimated him, thinking his youth made him reckless. They were wrong. Luciano used his intelligence as a silent weapon, slowly positioning himself for something far greater than neighborhood rackets. Every experience, from street fights to backroom deals, was shaping a new kind of gangster. One who didn't fear modernization, who embraced efficiency, who understood that power wasn't about owning a block but controlling the systems that fed into it. The young immigrant boy from Sicily had evolved into a strategist capable of seeing the underworld not as fragments, but as pieces of a machine waiting to be assembled. He didn't know it yet, but the chaos of New York's criminal world was steering him toward destiny. He had the instincts. He had the ambition. He had the network. And soon he would have the opportunity. Before Lucky Luciano built an empire, he built himself. And the streets were the forge that made him unbreakable. Building an empire was never a single moment of triumph. It was a slow, deliberate process, a layering of choices and alliances that pushed Lucky Luciano from a promising street figure to the quiet architect of a criminal revolution. By the early 1920s, New York's underworld was overflowing with power but starving for leadership. Dozens of gangs controlled individual neighborhoods, but none controlled the city. Each faction behaved like a small kingdom ruled by aging leaders obsessed with Sicilian customs and family honor. Luciano watched these men cling to outdated methods with frustration and opportunity. He understood that in America, success required organization, not tradition, innovation, not stubborn pride. And so he began constructing something new, a criminal network that would operate like a corporation rather than a tribe. His first major step was aligning himself with Joe, the boss Mafia, one of the most feared Sicilian leaders in New York. Mafia was powerful, brutal, and deeply traditional, everything Luciano was not. But Luciano knew that climbing the hierarchy required proximity to authority, even if he didn't respect it. Mafia valued soldiers who delivered results, and Luciano delivered them with quiet efficiency. He handled bootlegging routes, settled disputes, negotiated deals, and managed operations without drawing unnecessary attention. His ability to stay calm in volatile situations made him stand out in a world driven by impulse. But working under Mafia also revealed cracks in the old system. Mafia didn't trust outsiders. He refused to collaborate with Jewish or Irish gangs, refusing deals that could have doubled or tripled profits. He demanded loyalty not through respect, but through fear and suffocating obedience. Luciano realized that Mafia's leadership was not sustainable, and more importantly that it was preventing the entire organization from evolving. The Mafia needed modernization. Someone needed to do what no one dared, challenge the traditional hierarchy and build a structure that could survive beyond one boss's ego. Parallel to his rise under Mafia, Luciano deepened his alliances with two men who would become essential to his empire, Meyer Lansky and Benjamin Bugsy Siegel. Their partnership was groundbreaking. In a world where ethnicity determined loyalty, Luciano formed a business-driven alliance with Jewish gangsters who were just as ambitious and intelligent as he was. Lansky brought financial genius, an analytical mind capable of turning criminal operations into scalable enterprises. Siegel brought force, charisma, and a fearlessness that intimidated both allies and enemies. Together, the trio created a blueprint for cross-ethnic cooperation, something unimaginable under the old bosses. This alliance gave Luciano something Mafia could never offer: innovation. While Mafia fought petty turf wars, Luciano and Lansky built networks. They mapped out liquor routes, negotiated with Canadian suppliers, established bribery systems with local police, and created stable revenue streams during Prohibition. They managed gambling dens with business precision, cutting waste and maximizing profit. They brought in accountants, lawyers, and union contacts. Their operations ran smoother, faster, and more efficiently than anything controlled by the Mustache Pete's. Yet Luciano understood that true power required visibility and invisibility. He needed recognition from the criminal world to negotiate and lead effectively, but he also needed to remain insulated from the legal system. So he cultivated a dual image: the sharply dressed, confident gangster seen in nightclubs, laughing with actresses, tipping doormen, moving among the city's elite, and the shadow strategist who handled major decisions behind closed doors. This balance created an aura of sophistication that separated him from the brutish gangsters of earlier decades. To the public he was charming. To the underworld he was dangerous. The real turning point in building his empire came with the Castellamarese War, a bloody conflict between Mafia and rival boss Salvatore Maranzano. The war devastated New York's Italian underworld, claiming dozens of lives and destabilizing every major operation. But to Luciano, it was the greatest opportunity of his life. The conflict exposed the weaknesses of both bosses. Mafia was reckless and paranoid, Maranzano was controlling and authoritarian. Neither man represented the future Luciano envisioned. He decided he would no longer serve outdated leaders, he would replace them. This required more than ambition, it required orchestration. Luciano began maneuvering carefully. Behind Mafia's back, he communicated with Maranzano. Behind Maranzano's back, he reassured Mafia's soldiers. He collected information, identified weaknesses, and built alliances on both sides. He played a subtle game of balance, ensuring no one suspected his true intention, removing both bosses to create a new order under his leadership. The assassination of Mafia was the first decisive step. Luciano arranged a meeting with him under the pretense of loyalty, then slipped out moments before assassins entered. With Mafia gone, Maranzano believed Luciano was his loyal protégé. But Luciano saw that Maranzano intended to crown himself boss of all bosses, a title that contradicted everything Luciano wanted. He dreamed of a commission system, where families shared power equally and disputes were settled through structure, not ego. Maranzano, like Mafia, was too rooted in tradition. So Luciano eliminated him as well. With both bosses gone, Luciano finally acted on his vision. He reorganized the entire Mafia into 5 families, each with its own territory, leadership, and responsibilities. He created the Commission, a national board designed to regulate disputes and maintain order across state lines. No one man would rule. No boss would be above the system. It was a radical restructuring that transformed organized crime into a stable, profitable national enterprise. This was not just empire building, it was empire engineering. Luciano imposed rules, standardized practices, enforced accountability, and eliminated unnecessary violence. He treated crime as an industry and the men within it as departments of a corporation. Under his structure, the Mafia expanded far beyond New York, to Chicago, Detroit, Philadelphia, Cleveland, and eventually Havana and Las Vegas. The underworld had never seen anything like it. Luciano didn't simply rise to power, he built the foundation that elevated him there. Through alliances, betrayals, innovations, and a profound understanding of human psychology, he constructed a criminal empire that would outlive him by generations. When the dust settled and the city whispered his name, it wasn't because he had taken power by force. It was because he had designed a system that made him indispensable. This was the moment Lucky Luciano stopped being a gangster and became an architect. The empire wasn't an accident. It was engineered. And New York would never be the same again. The creation of the Commission marked a turning point in the history of organized crime, an innovation so radical that it fundamentally reshaped the underworld and set the blueprint for every criminal enterprise that followed. Before Lucky Luciano, the Mafia was a fragmented, violent collection of families, each acting like an isolated kingdom. Bosses ruled through fear, tradition, and brute force, with little regard for efficiency or sustainability. Disputes were settled with bullets rather than boards, and cooperation between families was rare, limited, and often temporary. Violence was the primary currency and chaos was inevitable. Luciano saw the consequences of this disorganization: endless bloodshed, unstable profits, and vulnerability to law enforcement. He realized that true power would come not from sheer violence alone, but from creating a structure that could contain it, an organization governed by rules, negotiation, and oversight. The Commission would be that structure. The idea was deceptively simple: organize the major families into a council that could arbitrate disputes, oversee operations, and maintain balance across the city and eventually the nation. Rather than concentrating power in the hands of a single boss of all bosses, Luciano envisioned a system where each family had autonomy but was accountable to a collective authority. It was a radical departure from Sicilian traditions, where loyalty to one boss and personal honor dictated every action. In America, Luciano realized survival required pragmatism. Murder and feuds were not only costly, they were unsustainable. The commission offered an alternative: codified rules, a forum for negotiation, and an infrastructure that elevated collective stability over individual pride. Structurally, the commission was composed of the heads of the 5 families of New York, each responsible for their own territories and operations but required to adhere to shared regulations. Decisions about violent retaliation, business partnerships, and territorial disputes were to be discussed collectively. Profit disputes could be mediated. Assassinations had to be approved. By introducing these mechanisms, Luciano reduced the chances of destructive infighting that had characterized the Castellamarese War and other turf battles. It was, in essence, a corporate board for organized crime, a governing body that replaced chaos with order, instinct with strategy. The creation of the commission required careful political maneuvering. Luciano needed to convince other family bosses that this system would benefit them, that it was in their interest to surrender some autonomy for the sake of stability and long-term profit. He had to balance ambition with diplomacy, demonstrating strength without threatening allies. This was one of Luciano's most significant achievements. He combined force, persuasion, and psychology to sell an idea that fundamentally challenged centuries of Sicilian tradition. The older bosses, steeped in notions of personal honor and absolute authority, were skeptical, but they recognized the inevitability of change. Luciano's reputation for cunning, fairness, and decisive action lent credibility to the proposal, and gradually the vision took hold. The commission's influence extended beyond New York. Its principles inspired similar structures in other cities, enabling coordinated operations across state lines. Members could engage in national bootlegging networks, gambling rings, and labor rackets without fearing constant interference from rival families. Violence, while still a tool, became regulated rather than rampant. Disputes were no longer automatically solved with bullets. Negotiation and mediation became the first line of defense. In this way, Luciano institutionalized a form of governance within the criminal world that mirrored legitimate business practices: hierarchy, accountability, and long-term strategic planning. Beyond structure, the commission also created a new culture of professionalism in crime. It emphasized loyalty not through fear alone, but through the promise of stability and prosperity. Members could see that adherence to rules resulted in predictable profits, protection from unnecessary risk, and the preservation of their family's power. For the first time, organized crime operated like a machine with interlocking parts, each dependent on the other for the system to function. Luciano's genius lay in understanding that power is more enduring when codified, predictable, and mutually respected, even in a world built on illegality. Psychologically, the commission represented a shift in how criminals viewed authority. Before, the highest form of power was the ability to strike fear with a gun. Now, power included negotiation, reputation, and strategic foresight. Luciano demonstrated that a system could command loyalty without relying exclusively on violence. By introducing shared governance, he reduced the risk of impulsive retaliation while increasing the incentive for cooperation. The commission created an environment where calculated decisions replaced emotional ones, turning chaos into manageable order. The commission also became a mechanism for conflict resolution, something the Mafia had never seen before. Previously, disputes between families often escalated into open warfare, leading to dozens of deaths and massive disruptions in operations. With a governing council, disagreements could be aired, debated, and resolved diplomatically, or if necessary through sanctioned enforcement. This reduced unnecessary bloodshed, stabilized operations, and increased profits. By offering a framework for structured decision-making, Luciano effectively professionalized criminal enterprise in a way that had never been achieved. The broader implications of the commission were profound. It changed the balance of power in New York, elevated the younger generation of gangsters over the old guard, and set the stage for a national syndicate. Luciano's vision transcended New York, influencing the structure of organized crime across America and even abroad. It created a model that would survive his eventual incarceration, exile, and death, a system where the rules were as powerful as the men enforcing them. Luciano had achieved something remarkable. He had converted the anarchic, violent world of street gangs into a codified, strategic, and enduring institution. By the end of the 1930s, the commission was more than a governing body, It was a symbol of Luciano's intelligence, foresight, and understanding of human nature. It represented the transformation of organized crime from chaotic, unpredictable violence into a machine of strategic power and calculated influence. Every decision made, every alliance formed, and every operation executed under its guidance reinforced the notion that organized crime could be as disciplined, efficient, and profitable as any legitimate business. Luciano had turned fear into law, chaos into order, and a collection of violent factions into a structured empire capable of enduring beyond his own lifetime. Through the commission, Luciano not only reshaped the Mafia, he redefined power itself. It was no longer solely about physical dominance. It was about strategy, influence, and the ability to orchestrate a system that others could not ignore. In doing so, he became not just a crime boss but a visionary, a strategist whose understanding of organization and human behavior would influence generations of criminal enterprises. The Mafia would never be the same, and neither would New York. The Mafia has always been more than guns, money, and territory. At its core lies a psychological engine, a system of beliefs and codes that governs every decision, every alliance, every betrayal. Central to this engine is the principle of omerta, the Sicilian code of silence, loyalty, and honor. A rule set so powerful that breaking it could mean not just death but social erasure. For the uninitiated, omerta appears as superstition, an archaic custom. But for Lucky Luciano, it was a tool, a framework through which fear, respect, and obedience could be engineered. Where older bosses relied on brute strength to command loyalty, Luciano understood that control rooted in psychological principle was far more efficient, subtle, and enduring. Omerta demanded silence in the face of law enforcement, forbade betrayal of allies, and required unwavering loyalty to the family. To outsiders, it seemed simple, almost sacred. A promise that certain things could never be spoken aloud, that family came above all else, and that honor was measured in the willingness to defend the code, even at personal cost. But the genius of Luciano lay in his ability to manipulate omerta as both shield and sword. To his allies, it was a guarantee of protection and stability. To his enemies, it was an invisible wall of fear, a boundary they could not cross without risking annihilation. Fear was the mechanism by which omerta worked. Luciano understood human nature intimately. People obey rules more reliably when the consequences for breaking them are immediate, unavoidable, and strategically terrifying. A man who violated the code was not only punished for the act itself but for undermining the entire system. The consequences were made visible, memorable, and often public. In this way, omerta extended beyond personal loyalty into a psychological doctrine. Fear became internalized, a self-enforcing principle among men who knew that deviation was death or worse, irrelevance. Yet omerta was not merely fear, it was also respect. Luciano used it to cultivate loyalty and admiration among his subordinates. He reinforced the idea that adherence to the code ensured prosperity, protection, and inclusion in a selective circle. Obedience became a rational choice. Follow the rules and you survive and thrive. Break them and the machinery of punishment activates. By embedding moral and practical incentives into the code, Luciano ensured that fear and loyalty were intertwined. The system worked not just because men feared him, but because they understood that his order made them more powerful collectively than they could be individually. Omerta also shaped decision-making at every level. Alliances were forged with careful attention to who could be trusted to honor the code. Business partnerships were evaluated not just for profit potential, but for psychological reliability. Men who were clever but untrustworthy were sidelined, regardless of capability. Those who displayed loyalty even under pressure were elevated. In essence, Luciano applied a form of organizational psychology long before the term existed. He selected, rewarded, and disciplined according to principles of trust, fear, and efficiency, all codified within the cultural framework of the Mafia. This code created a paradoxical environment. While it discouraged betrayal and indiscretion, it also demanded constant vigilance. Even the most loyal subordinate could become a threat if circumstances changed or opportunities arose. Luciano exploited this dynamic by maintaining uncertainty, unpredictability, and psychological pressure. He would reward obedience generously, but he also made clear that deviations, even minor, would be noticed and punished. The balance of fear and reward created a high-functioning criminal organization in which discipline was embedded not through constant supervision, but through internalized principles. Omerta also served as a buffer against law enforcement. By instilling a rigid culture of silence, Luciano reduced the risk of prosecution through informants. Witnesses were scarce not by accident but by design. The code created a web of loyalty that protected operations and made infiltration extremely difficult. The Mafia's ability to function despite constant police scrutiny was a testament to how psychological control could substitute for brute force in maintaining operational security. Men didn't speak not because they were threatened at that moment, but because their moral framework and social conditioning made betrayal unthinkable. Yet the psychological genius of Omerta extended beyond survival. It fostered identity and belonging within the criminal organization. Members were not simply workers or soldiers. They were participants in a moral system that defined right and wrong, loyalty and treachery, life and death. By providing a shared philosophy and social structure, Luciano ensured that men felt a sense of purpose and prestige in obeying the rules. This elevated the Mafia from a mere collection of criminals into a self-reinforcing society with its own culture, hierarchy, and psychological cohesion. Luciano's mastery of Omerta also allowed him to manipulate perception externally. To law enforcement, journalists, and rival gangsters, the code amplified his mystique. His operations seemed impenetrable, his network unbreakable because the men within it could not, and would not, talk. This perception of invincibility fed fear, creating a cycle in which respect and intimidation reinforced each other. Rivals often hesitated, unsure of how deep the loyalty ran or who might act on hidden instructions. Omerta became not just a code, but a strategic psychological weapon that extended Luciano's reach far beyond the limitations of his physical presence. Importantly, the code also allowed Luciano to blend ruthless pragmatism with subtle diplomacy. He could punish those who stepped out of line without undermining morale, mediate disputes without losing authority, and expand operations without inviting rebellion. Omerta was simultaneously rigid and flexible, personal and institutional. It gave him a framework to exercise extraordinary control over human behavior, using a combination of moral expectation, fear, and reward. In effect, Luciano transformed a cultural tradition into a tool of governance, turning loyalty into currency and fear into law. Ultimately, the psychology of fear and loyalty embedded in Omerta became the cornerstone of Luciano's empire. It allowed him to consolidate power, maintain order across vast territories, and establish a professionalized, disciplined criminal organization. Men obeyed not merely because they feared punishment, but because they understood the structure, the rationale, and the benefits of compliance. In doing so, Luciano demonstrated a rare understanding of human behavior, one that elevated him above mere gangsters and into the realm of strategist and architect. Through Omerta, he created a system where order, loyalty, and fear intertwined, an enduring blueprint that would define organized crime for decades to come. Luciano's genius was not only in controlling people but also in understanding the true engine of power: money. To him, the Mafia was not merely a collection of men enforcing codes of loyalty and fear, it was an enterprise, a business that needed revenue, structure, and foresight. He recognized early that chaos was profitable only in the short term. True wealth and long-term dominance required systematization. With this mindset, Luciano began transforming the 5 families of New York into sophisticated economic machines, each operating with clear responsibilities, defined territories, and coordinated objectives. While the city around him was chaotic, his operations ran with the precision of a corporate enterprise, turning every criminal activity into a predictable, scalable revenue stream. Prohibition had opened the doors to enormous profits, and Luciano was quick to exploit them. Bootlegging, once a small-time operation for street gangs, was expanded into a vast, organized distribution network. Warehouses in New Jersey, hidden docks along the Hudson River, and coordinated shipments from Canada ensured a steady flow of liquor into the city. Luciano didn't simply rely on brute force to protect his shipments. He orchestrated logistics, bribed police officers, and created communication networks that made disruptions rare. By turning an illegal trade into a professionalized enterprise, he not only maximized profits but minimized unnecessary violence, demonstrating his belief that efficiency and organization were more powerful than intimidation alone. Gambling was another cornerstone of his economic empire. Under Luciano's guidance, underground casinos, betting parlors, and poker dens multiplied across New York, providing a consistent and almost entirely controllable source of income. He understood human psychology. The thrill of chance, the hope of quick gain, and the habit-forming nature of gambling could be monetized on a massive scale. Unlike the erratic violence of traditional street-level gambling, Luciano's operations were structured, with a clear hierarchy of management, security protocols, and mechanisms to protect profits. Employees and associates were trained to enforce rules without drawing unnecessary attention, ensuring the business ran smoothly while reinforcing loyalty and discipline. Labor rackets and union infiltration became another pillar of Luciano's business model. He recognized that organized labor could be a lucrative asset if controlled strategically. By placing allies in key positions within unions, he could manipulate strikes, extort employers, and guarantee steady streams of protection money. These operations were less about brute force and more about subtlety, influence, negotiation, and the strategic application of threat. By integrating unions into his empire, Luciano gained a level of societal leverage that extended far beyond the streets, reaching into legitimate industries and politics. In effect, he blurred the lines between legal and illegal power, ensuring his influence extended into every layer of society. Prostitution and vice were also managed with ruthless efficiency. Brothels, high-end escorts, and illicit gambling dens operated under contracts and oversight, not random control. Men and women working in these enterprises were protected, sometimes literally by Luciano's men, and profits were carefully accounted for. He created a system where even morally dubious enterprises became predictable and manageable. The focus was always on maximizing return while minimizing exposure, a principle that applied across every facet of his criminal empire. This approach distinguished him from older bosses who relied on fear alone, often leading to instability and unnecessary loss. Luciano's approach to narcotics, although more cautious initially due to traditional resistance from older Sicilian bosses, eventually became part of his strategic vision. He understood that drugs could be highly profitable if managed carefully, but he also recognized the legal and public relations risks. Therefore, operations were compartmentalized, routes were controlled with military precision, and partners were carefully vetted. The introduction of narcotics into his empire illustrated a broader principle. Luciano never engaged in an activity recklessly. Every venture was considered, planned, and executed within a framework that prioritized stability, profitability, and the minimization of risk. International connections played a critical role in expanding his empire. Luciano maintained networks with Canadian bootleggers, Jewish and Irish crime groups, and eventually with syndicates in Cuba and Latin America. These alliances allowed him to coordinate shipments, expand markets, and diversify revenue streams far beyond the confines of New York. Unlike his predecessors who were limited by parochial loyalties, Luciano's vision encompassed a transnational criminal enterprise. He saw opportunity where others saw boundaries, and he used these connections to strengthen his overall control of organized crime. Each revenue stream was meticulously organized with clear accountability. Managers oversaw operations, soldiers enforced compliance, and higher-ups monitored profitability. Luciano's empire functioned much like a modern corporation, decentralized enough to maintain efficiency, centralized enough to enforce uniform strategy. Every decision, whether it was allocating territory for a new gambling operation or negotiating a new bootlegging route, was made with data, observation, and careful planning rather than impulse. The business mentality was revolutionary for organized crime, transforming it from a series of violent, unpredictable gangs into a stable, professionalized network capable of long-term growth. What set Luciano apart was his understanding of human behavior within business operations. Men obeyed rules not simply because of fear, but because they understood that following his system increased their own security and prosperity. Loyalty was intertwined with economic incentives. Success within the enterprise was measurable and achievable, creating motivation that extended beyond coercion. This created an internal culture of efficiency, discipline, and ambition, where soldiers and lieutenants were invested in the growth of the empire itself, rather than acting solely out of fear of punishment. By the mid-1930s, Luciano's 5 families had become more than criminal organizations. They were sophisticated, vertically integrated empires. Bootlegging, gambling, labor manipulation, vice, and eventually narcotics all operated under a unified strategic vision. Each family's operations complemented the others, reducing conflict, increasing efficiency, and amplifying collective profitability. Luciano had transformed the chaotic underworld into a self-regulating economy, governed by rules, incentives, and the implicit power of fear and respect. In essence, Luciano's business model turned crime into commerce, violence into management, and loyalty into structured efficiency. The Mafia was no longer a collection of violent individuals fighting for scraps. It was a disciplined network capable of sustainable growth, long-term influence, and strategic domination. Through careful planning, innovative partnerships, and a profound understanding of both economics and human psychology, Lucky Luciano had transformed the 5 families into a machine, a criminal corporation designed to endure, expand, and operate with unprecedented precision. It was a level of sophistication that the city had never seen, and it would define organized crime for generations. Rivals and alliances defined the landscape of Luciano's world, a world in which trust was a fragile currency and betrayal lurked behind every handshake. As he expanded his influence across New York, he had to navigate a labyrinth of power dynamics that involved men with ambitions as sharp as knives and egos as fragile as glass. The Mafia was no longer just about managing your own operations, it was about understanding the motives, fears, and desires of every player on the field. Each alliance was a strategic maneuver, each friendship a potential weapon, and every enemy a problem to be neutralized before it escalated into war. Luciano understood that survival and success depended on this delicate balancing act. Managing allies without alienating them, intimidating enemies without provoking unnecessary conflict, and exploiting opportunities with precision and subtlety. At the center of this intricate web were figures like Meyer Lansky, Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, and Frank Costello. Lansky was the financier, the man who translated strategy into dollars. Siegel was the enforcer, the fearless operator who commanded loyalty through courage and intimidation. Costello, with his political savvy and calm demeanor, acted as a bridge between the criminal world and legitimate society. These men were more than partners, they were extensions of Luciano's strategic mind. Each brought unique skills to the table, complementing his vision of a modern, efficient, and expansive criminal empire. Together, they created a system in which operational efficiency, financial acumen, and political influence converged, giving Luciano a level of power that was unparalleled in New York. But alliances alone were insufficient. Rivalries were inevitable in a world where ambition collided with opportunity. The Castellamarese War, which had decimated the old Sicilian hierarchy, was only the beginning. Even after Luciano consolidated power, other ambitious gangsters sought to challenge his authority, testing both the limits of his strategy and the loyalty of his allies. Figures like Vito Genovese, who harbored ambitions of leadership, became sources of tension within the organization. Luciano had to exercise constant vigilance, balancing subtle intimidation with tactical inclusion. He rewarded loyalty generously, but he also made clear that betrayal would be met with swift and uncompromising consequences. Betrayal was a constant threat, not only from rivals but sometimes from within his own ranks. In a criminal network where ambition and greed were driving forces, men could easily shift allegiances for personal gain. Luciano's understanding of human psychology allowed him to anticipate these moves before they happened. He carefully cultivated relationships, observing behavior, testing loyalty, and strategically placing men in positions where their interests aligned with his. He turned potential threats into collaborators and neutralized adversaries with precision, often before they even realized they were being outmaneuvered. This preemptive strategy was key to maintaining control in a volatile environment. The dynamics of power were further complicated by ethnic and generational divides. Older Sicilian bosses, the Mustache Petes, resisted Luciano's modern approach and his willingness to collaborate with Jewish and Irish gangsters. Their disdain for cross-ethnic alliances posed both a political and operational challenge. Luciano managed this by emphasizing results over tradition, demonstrating that cooperation increased profit and stability. Younger gangsters, on the other hand, were drawn to his vision of a meritocratic system where intelligence and capability mattered more than birthright or family lineage. By bridging these divides, Luciano positioned himself as a unifying figure whose vision transcended the limitations of tradition, creating loyalty that was both pragmatic and deeply personal. Alliances and rivalries also extended into the legitimate world. Luciano's operations required the cooperation, or at least the acquiescence, of police, politicians, and business leaders. Corruption was a tool, carefully wielded to secure permits, prevent raids, and protect revenue streams. These relationships required negotiation, subtle pressure, and the occasional display of controlled violence to ensure compliance. Unlike street-level gangsters, Luciano operated with a strategic awareness that the law could be as malleable as any alliance, provided it was approached with intelligence and careful timing. The hidden war within the Mafia was therefore as much about perception as it was about action. Luciano's ability to manage how he and his allies were perceived allowed him to control the behavior of rivals indirectly. Men hesitated, recalculated, and sometimes capitulated simply because they understood the extent of his influence. By combining the tangible threat of violence with the psychological power of reputation, Luciano created an environment in which loyalty was both incentivized and enforced, and betrayal carried consequences that extended beyond immediate physical harm to include long-term political and operational marginalization. Financial stakes intensified these dynamics. As Luciano expanded bootlegging, gambling, and labor operations, the potential for profit attracted both opportunistic allies and ambitious rivals. Every successful venture required careful negotiation of who would share in the spoils and how disputes would be resolved. By formalizing these arrangements and tying them to his overarching organizational structure, Luciano reduced uncertainty and created predictability in an otherwise chaotic underworld. Even rivals recognized that aligning with him rather than opposing him was often the most rational choice. Ultimately, Luciano's management of allies and enemies reflected a sophisticated understanding of power as a multidimensional force. It was not merely about who had the biggest gun or the most men, it was about strategy, psychology, influence, and the subtle orchestration of human behavior. Through careful alliance building, targeted intimidation, and preemptive neutralization of threats, Luciano transformed the criminal landscape of New York into a controlled ecosystem in which he was the central architect. His rise depended as much on his ability to navigate these relationships as on his operational brilliance, demonstrating that true leadership in the underworld was as much about diplomacy and perception as it was about force. By balancing ambition, loyalty, and fear, Luciano created a system in which his authority was rarely questioned, his decisions were respected, and his empire could expand without constant internal disruption. The web of allies and enemies he managed not only secured his dominance but laid the foundation for a new era of organized crime, one defined by strategic intelligence, calculated violence, and the subtle art of human manipulation. In this hidden war, Luciano did not simply survive, he conquered. The hidden war that had shaped Luciano's rise was not fought only with bullets or money, it was fought in shadows, in whispers, and in rooms where a single word could change the balance of power forever. By the mid-1930s, New York's underworld had been reshaped by Luciano's vision. The commission governed disputes, the five families operated with unprecedented efficiency, and cross-ethnic alliances brought stability to previously fractured networks. Yet even in this carefully engineered empire, danger lurked. The Mafia was a world where loyalty was conditional, alliances were fragile, and ambition was a constant undercurrent. Power could be stolen, influence could be challenged, and one misstep could lead to sudden violent downfall. The hidden war, therefore, was a constant balancing act, a game of strategy, intimidation, and foresight, where Luciano's survival depended on his ability to anticipate every possible threat. The Castellamarese War may have ended, but its lessons remained. Luciano had learned that the old Sicilian bosses were predictable in their brutality but blind to innovation. Eliminating Masuria and Maranzano had required careful planning, deception, and timing. Yet even after their removal, the risk of conflict never disappeared. Ambitious lieutenants within his own organization, external rivals from other cities, and law enforcement eager to exploit any weakness meant that Luciano had to operate with constant vigilance. Violence could erupt anywhere at any time, often without warning, and even minor disputes had the potential to escalate into full-scale war. The hidden war was therefore as psychological as it was physical, a battle of nerves, perception, and influence. Law enforcement pressure intensified this hidden conflict. Federal authorities and local police were increasingly aware of the Mafia's operations, though evidence was difficult to gather due to the Code of Omerta. Investigations, surveillance, and occasional arrests created a climate of uncertainty that Luciano had to manage. He could not rely solely on fear and loyalty within his ranks. He also had to manipulate perception externally. Bribes, misinformation, and political influence became tools of survival. Luciano understood that the Mafia's greatest vulnerability was exposure, and he meticulously orchestrated operations to minimize risk, ensure plausible deniability, and maintain a veneer of invisibility even as his empire expanded. The hidden war also unfolded within alliances. Not every associate shared Luciano's vision or discipline. Figures like Vito Genovese and Frank Costello, while loyal, had their own ambitions, and the potential for internal strife was ever present. Luciano's ability to manage these relationships relied on a combination of calculated reward, subtle intimidation, and psychological insight. He needed to ensure that key lieutenants remained invested in the collective vision of the five families while simultaneously neutralizing any seeds of dissent before they could threaten his authority. This internal vigilance was essential to sustaining the empire's stability, turning the hidden war into a daily exercise in diplomacy, psychology, and strategic foresight. Beyond the city itself, the hidden war extended into national networks. Luciano's influence had reached Chicago, Philadelphia, Detroit, and even Cuba, creating opportunities for expansion but also attracting attention from ambitious rivals and competing organizations. Coordination across such distances required trust, secrecy, and a constant flow of information. Miscommunication could result in conflict or financial loss. Luciano relied on a combination of coded messages, trusted intermediaries, and careful monitoring to maintain cohesion across the empire. In doing so, he demonstrated a mastery of operational logistics and organizational psychology that rivaled legitimate business magnates. Violence, when deployed, was precise and intentional. Unlike the chaotic killings of the pre-Luciano era, attacks under his guidance were calculated, often strategic messages aimed at reinforcing authority or neutralizing threats. Assassinations were carefully planned to avoid collateral damage, minimize public exposure, and maximize psychological impact. Each action was designed not merely to remove an opponent but to influence the behavior of others, to deter betrayal, enforce loyalty, and demonstrate control. The hidden war, therefore, was fought with both action and perception, where a single death could ripple through the organization and the city, altering allegiances and consolidating power. Psychologically, the hidden war exacted a toll on Luciano and those around him. Living in a world where threat was constant required a heightened awareness, an ability to anticipate human behavior, and a cold pragmatism that could override personal emotion. Fear and respect were tools, but they were also burdens. Decisions had consequences, and the margin for error was minimal. Luciano cultivated a persona of calm authority, projecting confidence even while navigating a landscape of constant uncertainty. This image reinforced his dominance and discouraged rivals from challenging him, while simultaneously allowing him to manipulate both allies and enemies with subtlety. Corruption within law enforcement and political spheres became an extension of the hidden war. Bribes, threats, and alliances with officials ensured that operations could continue uninterrupted and investigations could be deflected. Luciano's understanding of these dynamics was sophisticated. He did not simply pay for silence. He created interdependencies that made officials reliant on his operations for their own power, security, or profit. By embedding influence within legitimate systems, he added a layer of protection that extended the reach of his hidden war beyond the streets and into the corridors of power. The hidden war also demanded constant adaptation. As federal authorities became more sophisticated, as rival families attempted to assert influence, and as public scrutiny increased, Luciano had to anticipate changes and pivot strategies accordingly. His ability to remain several steps ahead of both allies and adversaries distinguished him from predecessors who had relied purely on force. The hidden war was not static. It was a fluid battlefield where intelligence, psychological insight, and operational discipline determined survival and dominance. In essence, the hidden war was the lifeblood of Luciano's empire. It was the silent engine that sustained control, the unseen pressure that kept alliances in line, and the strategic landscape in which every move had consequences. Success was not measured merely by the elimination of enemies or accumulation of wealth, but by the ability to maintain stability, manage perception, and enforce loyalty across an empire fraught with danger. Luciano's mastery of this hidden war cemented his position as the architect of modern organized crime, demonstrating that true power lay not in open confrontation alone, but in the unseen strategies, calculated risks, and psychological orchestration that defined his reign. It was within this hidden war that Luciano's intelligence, foresight, and ruthlessness converged, ensuring that his empire did not merely survive, it dominated. Every negotiation, every threat, every carefully executed operation was part of a larger, continuous struggle to control a city, an industry, and the human behaviors that sustained both. And in this silent battlefield, Luciano proved that true leadership was not about brute force. It was about mastering the complex interplay of power, fear, loyalty, and strategy. The fall of Lucky Luciano was neither sudden nor dramatic in the way that his rise had been violent and calculated. It began quietly, almost imperceptibly, as law enforcement scrutiny intensified and political tides shifted against the organized crime networks he had so carefully built. While the Mafia thrived on secrecy, visibility had increased in the 1930s. Newspapers sensationalized gang activity, federal investigators gained more sophisticated tools, and the public demanded action against the perceived lawlessness of urban centers. Luciano, who had spent decades orchestrating operations with near-military precision, suddenly found that the systems he had built to control risk were now being turned against him. The fall began as a slow erosion, a series of legal, political, and personal pressures that would culminate in a trial that shocked the nation. 4 years, Luciano had managed his empire with remarkable foresight, ensuring that operations were compartmentalized, subordinates were loyal, and evidence trails were minimal. Yet no system is impervious, and cracks began to appear. Federal authorities, emboldened by growing public outrage over organized crime and Prohibition-era corruption, started investigating labor rackets, gambling operations, and vice syndicates with unprecedented intensity. The Department of Justice and the Bureau of Narcotics coordinated with local police, building cases using informants, surveillance, and painstaking documentation. The very networks that had once protected him became sources of vulnerability as the law focused its lens on the Mafia's most prominent figures. The first tangible sign of Luciano's vulnerability came through his associates. Loyalty, while deeply ingrained through the code of omerta, could be bought, coerced, or broken under pressure. Some subordinates, facing the threat of prosecution, were willing to cooperate with law enforcement to save themselves. The intelligence gathered through these channels provided prosecutors with enough material to begin connecting the dots between Luciano and the criminal enterprises he oversaw. While he was careful never to be directly implicated in day-to-day crimes, the indirect evidence painted a compelling narrative, that of a man orchestrating a vast, illegal empire from the shadows. Pressure also came from unexpected directions. Political leaders, eager to demonstrate their commitment to law and order, began targeting mafia operations aggressively. New York Governor Herbert Lehman, along with federal authorities, coordinated raids on gambling dens, brothels, and union offices, making it increasingly difficult for Luciano to operate openly. Bribes and influence could no longer guarantee safety, as political attention brought media scrutiny, which in turn made corruption riskier. The city itself was becoming a trap. Every operation was exposed to inspection, every alliance at risk of exposure, and every subordinate a potential source of incrimination. The careful architecture of his empire was under siege, not by rival gangsters, but by the relentless machinery of law and public pressure. As the investigation progressed, Luciano faced internal threats as well. Ambitious lieutenants and old rivals saw the growing pressure from authorities as an opportunity. Men like Vito Genovese were positioning themselves to capitalize on any weakness, quietly consolidating power and expanding influence within the five families. While Luciano's strategic brilliance had long maintained unity, the stress of legal scrutiny strained the delicate balance he had orchestrated. Allies were forced to make difficult choices. Some remained loyal while others acted out of self-preservation. The psychological toll on Luciano was immense. He had built an empire of loyalty and fear, yet both were being tested in ways he had never fully anticipated. The culmination of these pressures came in the form of the 1936 to 1937 investigations into prostitution and vice operations. Law enforcement had been meticulously documenting transactions, associates, and hierarchies within Luciano's network. Witnesses, some of whom were coerced into testimony, began to paint a picture of an organized system with Luciano at its center. The strategy that had served him so well, delegating operations, insulating himself from direct criminal acts, and maintaining layers of protection, was now being dissected by prosecutors. It was a moment of reckoning. The empire that had seemed invulnerable was suddenly exposed to the full force of law, public opinion, and political ambition. Luciano's personal life also became a source of vulnerability. His high-profile relationships, lavish lifestyle, and visibility in the social scene drew attention that his predecessors had managed to avoid. Journalists documented his movements, photographers captured his presence at clubs and casinos, and gossip made its way into police reports and court files. The man who had cultivated an image of untouchable authority now found himself scrutinized for every action, every connection, and every indulgence. The fall, therefore, was as much a product of exposure and perception as it was of legal proceedings. Despite these mounting pressures, Luciano initially attempted to navigate the situation strategically. He sought to protect his empire by reinforcing loyalty among his subordinates, negotiating with law enforcement intermediaries, and using his political connections to delay or mitigate legal action. He understood the stakes and attempted to adapt, employing the same strategic thinking that had made him successful. Yet the forces arrayed against him, media, law enforcement, political will, and internal ambition, were formidable and relentless. Each maneuver bought him time, but it could not halt the inexorable pressure closing in from all sides. The hidden war, which had once been managed in shadows with precision and psychological control, was now being fought in courtrooms and public opinion. Luciano's operations, which had thrived under secrecy and careful orchestration, were now exposed to analysis, testimony, and scrutiny. Every past decision, every delegated responsibility, and every alliance was examined for culpability. The empire that had seemed untouchable was suddenly vulnerable to the law in a way that was impossible to control from the shadows. Ultimately, the fall of Lucky Luciano was a convergence of law, politics, betrayal, and exposure. The systems that he had designed to protect his empire, loyalty, omerta, strategic delegation, were strained to their limits by the relentless pursuit of justice and the ambition of those around him. While he remained resourceful, intelligent, and composed, the forces arrayed against him were unprecedented in scale and sophistication. The hidden war that had ensured his rise now threatened to undo everything he had built, proving that even the most brilliant strategist could be brought low by the combined weight of legal scrutiny, political ambition, and the fragile human loyalties upon which all empires ultimately depend. It was in this period that Luciano realized that survival required adaptation, negotiation, and sometimes the painful recognition that even the greatest power structures could be dismantled when exposed to relentless pressure. The fall had begun not with a single dramatic event, but through a series of compounding forces that would culminate in a trial destined to define his legacy and test the very limits of the criminal empire he had spent a lifetime constructing. Even behind bars, Lucky Luciano's power did not simply vanish. Prison was meant to contain him, to strip him of influence, yet he had built an empire so structurally sound that confinement could not completely sever his control. From his cell, Luciano continued to orchestrate operations, issue directives, and manage alliances across New York and beyond. The mechanisms he had put in place, the commission, the hierarchy of the five families, and the loyalty enforced through omerta, functioned independently enough that his physical absence did not immediately destabilize the criminal network. To understand how he retained influence from prison is to understand not just the strength of the system he had created, but also his mastery of psychology, perception, and strategic foresight. Luciano's imprisonment was the culmination of mounting legal pressure, betrayal, and investigative persistence by law enforcement. Sentenced to a lengthy term for compulsory prostitution and other criminal activities, he faced the reality that his freedom was curtailed. Many would have assumed that his reign had ended. Yet the man who had revolutionized organized crime had prepared for contingencies. He had delegated authority carefully, installed loyal lieutenants in key positions, and ensured that communication channels remained intact. Orders were passed discreetly through trusted intermediaries, visits were structured strategically, and coded correspondence allowed him to influence decisions without directly incriminating himself. Even the prison walls could not contain a mind as calculating as his. Maintaining power from prison required more than delegation, it required perception. Luciano understood that respect and fear were as much psychological constructs as tangible realities. By cultivating an image of unbroken authority, he ensured that his absence did not embolden rivals or create factionalism. Lieutenants who might have been tempted to assert independence understood that loyalty was still expected, and deviation could carry consequences once he regained freedom. Reports of his ongoing influence circulated among prisoners, guards, and external associates, reinforcing the notion that Luciano remained a figure of control even when confined. This perception became a force multiplier. If men believed he was still omnipotent, they behaved accordingly, maintaining order in a way that required no direct enforcement. Luciano's use of intermediaries was highly sophisticated. Trusted lieutenants served as his proxies, transmitting instructions to family heads and managing day-to-day operations with discretion. These men were carefully chosen for intelligence, loyalty, and discretion, ensuring that messages were not distorted and that power remained centralized in Luciano's orbit. The structure mirrored a corporate hierarchy. Executives delegated authority but maintained oversight through regular reporting and accountability. Even in prison, Luciano effectively functioned as the CEO of a criminal conglomerate, demonstrating a rare ability to extend influence across physical barriers. Beyond internal operations, Luciano continued to navigate the political and legal environment from behind bars. He maintained connections with politicians, law enforcement officials, and influential figures who could intervene on his behalf. These relationships were cultivated over years and were reinforced even during incarceration. He understood the value of patience. In time, circumstances would shift, allies would regain power, and opportunities for negotiation or early release would emerge. Luciano's strategic mind viewed prison not as an end, but as a temporary obstacle, a challenge to be managed rather than a permanent defeat. The psychological aspect of power and confinement cannot be overstated. Prison is designed to isolate, to diminish the sense of autonomy and authority. Yet Luciano's awareness of human behavior allowed him to turn this environment to his advantage. Guards, fellow inmates, and even rivals understood that the man behind bars wielded influence beyond the walls. By carefully controlling interactions, observing behaviors, and rewarding loyalty within the prison ecosystem, he reinforced his authority and maintained operational control indirectly. Every action, every conversation, and every visit became an instrument in the larger strategy of sustaining power. Luciano also recognized the importance of maintaining morale and loyalty among his associates outside. His ongoing guidance, even from prison, reassured family heads and lieutenants that the organization remained stable. Fear and respect, carefully balanced, ensured compliance. Those who might have been tempted to exploit his absence understood that he could still punish betrayal, financially or violently, through intermediaries. The invisible threads of influence ensured continuity, stability, and cohesion, hallmarks of an organization he had meticulously structured for resilience. However, maintaining control from prison was not without challenges. Rival factions attempted to test his authority, ambitious lieutenants sought leverage, and law enforcement intensified scrutiny on communication channels. Every misstep could have disrupted operations or exposed vulnerabilities. Yet Luciano's foresight, combined with the resilient architecture of his empire, allowed him to navigate these challenges. By emphasizing centralized strategy, trusted intermediaries, and the psychological weight of his reputation, he minimized the risk of destabilization and reinforced the perception of unbroken power. Luciano's control behind bars also demonstrates a key lesson about leadership. Influence is not solely dependent on physical presence. By building robust systems, cultivating loyalty, and understanding the interplay of fear, respect, and reward, he extended his reach far beyond the limitations of the prison walls. His operations continued to generate revenue, enforce discipline, and maintain strategic expansion. The man who had revolutionized organized crime had proven that an empire, if intelligently designed, could endure, even when its architect was temporarily removed from the battlefield. Ultimately, Luciano's time in prison solidified his reputation as a master strategist. While other gangsters' power crumbled in the face of confinement, his empire remained functional, disciplined, and profitable. His continued influence underscored the effectiveness of his systems. The Commission, cross-ethnic alliances, operational compartmentalization, and the Code of Omerta. Through a combination of psychological insight, meticulous planning, and organizational acumen, Luciano demonstrated that true power is as much about structure and perception as it is about force. Even behind bars, he remained the central figure in the underworld, guiding his empire with the same precision and authority that had defined his rise, ensuring that when freedom returned, his position at the apex of organized crime would remain unchallenged. The exile of Lucky Luciano marked a profound turning point in his life, a forced removal from the empire he had meticulously built, yet a chapter that would test both his resilience and his strategic mind. In 1946, after serving a prison sentence for compulsory prostitution, Luciano was deported to Italy, ostensibly to remove him from American soil and diminish his influence over the five families. On the surface, exile seemed a definitive end. The man who had redefined organized crime in New York was now physically distant, his empire ostensibly beyond reach. But Luciano's understanding of power, influence, and human psychology allowed him to navigate this dramatic upheaval with the same precision that had defined his rise. Exile became not merely a punishment, but a new arena in which he could extend influence, negotiate survival, and redefine his identity on the global stage. Arriving in Naples, Luciano faced a city scarred by the devastation of World War II, a landscape of ruin and political instability. Unlike New York, Italy presented a fragmented society, struggling with the dual pressures of reconstruction and lawlessness. Yet Luciano, ever the strategist, recognized opportunity even in chaos. The Mafia in Sicily and southern Italy remained active, but unorganized compared to the network he had structured in New York. Through subtle connections, intermediaries, and careful observation, he began to reassert influence across borders, using the experience as a chance to build alliances that could later benefit operations abroad. Though physically removed, Luciano's understanding of global criminal networks allowed him to maintain relevance far beyond the immediate streets of Naples. Politically, exile placed Luciano in a precarious position. Italian authorities were wary of his presence, and law enforcement monitored him closely, cognizant of his reputation and capacity for influence. Yet Luciano navigated these challenges with a combination of diplomacy, negotiation, and psychological insight. He cultivated relationships with local officials and influential figures, leveraging his status as a figure of international notoriety to secure a degree of protection and operational latitude. The exile forced him to adapt. Where once he had commanded loyalty through fear and reputation, he now had to negotiate it through diplomacy, subtlety, and influence in an unfamiliar environment. During his time in Italy, Luciano also reflected on the philosophy of power, loyalty, and survival. Removed from the immediacy of the five families and the day-to-day operations of New York, he had the distance to analyze his life, his empire, and the human behaviors that had both elevated and imperiled him. He understood that power was both ephemeral and malleable. While his empire remained intact in structure, his physical absence forced him to reconcile with the limits of control. Exile became a crucible in which strategy met reflection, and in which the intellectual and psychological dimensions of leadership came into sharper focus. Luciano began to appreciate that influence could transcend geography, and that reputation and systems could, in some cases, be more powerful than physical presence. Exile also opened the door to new forms of international involvement. During World War II, the U.S. government approached Luciano regarding the stability of Sicily as Allied forces planned the invasion of Italy. Leveraging his knowledge of the Sicilian Mafia, the port networks, and local dynamics, Luciano provided assistance in exchange for leniency and strategic consideration regarding his eventual return. This collaboration illustrated his ability to navigate complex political landscapes, transforming a punitive measure into a strategic opportunity. He demonstrated that power was not confined to direct control of criminal enterprises but could be exercised through information, negotiation, and strategic alignment with global forces. The exile period was also marked by attempts to maintain connection with the five families and his broader criminal network. Through intermediaries and careful correspondence, Luciano ensured that his influence over operations, decisions, and alliances continued, even from a distance. He monitored disputes, approved major decisions, and maintained lines of communication that reinforced his authority. Though he could not physically enforce directives, the architecture he had established, the commission, trusted lieutenants, and a culture of loyalty, ensured that his absence did not equate to a collapse of power. Distance became a new dimension of strategic management, testing the durability of the empire he had built. Culturally, exile forced Luciano to reconcile with a different social environment. Italy, while connected by language and heritage, was far removed from the urban intensity of New York's criminal underworld. He had to adapt to new customs, navigate different hierarchies, and operate in a society recovering from war. Yet these challenges reinforced his flexibility and strategic insight. Luciano understood that power was relational. Influence was maintained not through intimidation alone, but through relationships, strategic negotiation, and the careful cultivation of reputation. His exile became a masterclass in adapting strategy to environment, demonstrating that leadership required both resilience and ingenuity. Philosophically, Luciano's exile also underscored the duality of his life. He was both a product of his environment and a shaper of it. Removed from the streets he once ruled, he reflected on the moral ambiguities of loyalty, fear, and control. He had built an empire that operated on fear, respect, and strategic intelligence, yet exile reminded him of the fragility of even the most meticulously constructed systems. It was a lesson in humility and strategy. Even the most powerful figures must adapt when circumstances change. Luciano's ability to navigate exile without relinquishing relevance exemplified his enduring mastery of human behavior, organizational dynamics, and geopolitical influence. Ultimately, the exile and endgame phase of Luciano's life illustrated the evolution of a strategist. From New York to Naples, from active control to remote influence, he demonstrated that power is not solely a function of proximity or coercion, but of foresight, systems, and psychological leverage. While his physical presence was curtailed, his intellectual and strategic reach remained formidable. Luciano's exile was not merely punishment, it was a testament to the durability of the empire he had built and the flexibility of a mind capable of exerting influence across oceans, legal systems, and cultural landscapes. It was here, in the crucible of forced displacement, that the man behind the legend refined his understanding of power, legacy, and the subtle art of control that had defined his life and would shape organized crime for generations to come. The legacy of Lucky Luciano is both complex and enduring, a testament to a man whose influence reshaped organized crime and left an indelible mark on modern criminal enterprises. Long after his death, his innovations continue to reverberate, defining the structures, strategies, and psychological principles that govern organized crime around the world. Luciano's genius lay not in raw brutality, but in the orchestration of systems, alliances, and psychological control that transformed disparate, chaotic gangs into a disciplined, professionalized network capable of long-term sustainability. By codifying hierarchy, standardizing operations, and instilling loyalty and fear through the Code of Omerta, he created a blueprint that turned criminal activity into an enterprise, a model so resilient that it became the foundation for organized crime globally. Perhaps the most significant aspect of Luciano's legacy is the Commission, the governing body he helped establish to mediate disputes and enforce rules among the five families. Prior to Luciano, Mafia factions operated largely independently, often resorting to violent conflict to resolve disputes. The Commission introduced a system of governance, conflict resolution, and collective decision-making that minimized internecine warfare and maximized efficiency. By institutionalizing authority, he transformed the Mafia from a collection of autonomous gangs into a structured network capable of strategic collaboration. This innovation ensured not only the survival of the organization but also its expansion, influence, and profitability, and it became a model emulated by organized crime groups far beyond New York. Luciano's methods also redefined the relationship between crime and business. He viewed illegal operations not as chaotic ventures dependent on brute force, but as enterprises requiring management, strategy, and accountability. Bootlegging, gambling, labor rackets, and vice were all systematized under a hierarchical structure, with responsibilities delegated to trusted lieutenants and operations coordinated across networks. Profitability and efficiency became guiding principles, and violence was employed not randomly, but as a calculated tool to maintain control, enforce loyalty, and deter rivals. This professionalization of crime set a precedent, demonstrating that criminal enterprises could be both highly organized and highly profitable, and shaping the strategic approach of generations of gangsters to come. The psychological dimension of Luciano's legacy is equally profound. Through the disciplined application of fear, loyalty, and respect, he maintained control over men who were ambitious, violent, and unpredictable. The Code of Omerta became more than a cultural tradition. It was a tool of governance, a system that ensured compliance through both moral and practical incentives. Loyalty was rewarded, betrayal punished, and fear internalized, creating a self-enforcing system that allowed his organization to function efficiently even in his absence. Luciano demonstrated a rare understanding of human behavior, showing that control could be exercised as much through perception, psychological influence, and strategic delegation as through direct action. His legacy also extends to the intersection of organized crime and legitimate society. Luciano recognized the importance of political influence, corruption, and social leverage as tools to protect and expand his empire. By cultivating relationships with politicians, law enforcement officials, and business leaders, he ensured that his operations could continue with minimal disruption. This integration of criminal enterprise and legitimate systems demonstrated his capacity for strategic foresight and political savvy, showing that power could be exerted not only through fear and violence but also through negotiation, influence, and the manipulation of perception. Internationally, Luciano's impact was far-reaching. His connections with criminal networks in Canada, Cuba, and Europe extended the scope of organized crime beyond the United States, demonstrating that his vision of a transnational criminal enterprise was achievable. These alliances facilitated the flow of goods, capital, and influence across borders, laying the groundwork for global organized crime structures that persist to this day. By envisioning crime as a coordinated, international network rather than a collection of local operations, Luciano set a precedent for strategic expansion that would influence criminal organizations worldwide. Luciano's personal mythos also contributed to his enduring legacy. He became the archetype of the modern gangster, intelligent, ruthless, strategic, and charismatic. Popular culture, films, literature, and later documentaries drew on his life to construct an image of the sophisticated criminal mastermind, a man whose intellect and ambition rivaled those of legitimate businessmen. While the mythology often glossed over the brutality inherent in his world, it cemented his status as a symbol of power, strategy, and the dark allure of organized crime. This cultural representation reinforced the practical lessons of his life, teaching subsequent generations that success in the criminal underworld required vision, intelligence, and psychological acumen. Yet Luciano's legacy is not solely a story of triumph. It is also a cautionary tale about the limits of power, the consequences of exposure, and the fragility of even the most meticulously constructed empires. His imprisonment and exile demonstrated that legal, political, and human factors could undermine control, no matter how sophisticated the system. Nevertheless, even in confinement and exile, Luciano maintained influence, proving that a well-structured organization could endure beyond the immediate presence of its leader. His life underscores the duality of power. It can create lasting institutions, yet it remains subject to external forces, human ambition, and the unpredictable currents of history. Finally, Luciano's influence reshaped the psychology of organized crime. By professionalizing operations, institutionalizing governance, and mastering the interplay of fear, loyalty, and strategic vision, he set a standard for leadership in the criminal underworld. His model demonstrated that enduring power was achieved not merely through violence, but through intellect, structure, and the subtle orchestration of human behavior. In this sense, his legacy transcends the specific crimes he committed, offering insight into the dynamics of authority, influence, and organizational control that are relevant even beyond the world of crime. In essence, the legacy of Lucky Luciano is the story of transformation, the transformation of disorganized gangs into structured enterprises, of fear into a tool of governance, and of crime into a disciplined, strategic operation capable of sustaining influence across decades and continents. He left behind more than wealth or notoriety. He left a blueprint, a system of leadership, psychology, and organization that continues to define organized crime. Through brilliance, ruthlessness, and strategic insight, Luciano became not just a historical figure, but the architect of an empire whose lessons and influence resonate to this day, shaping the criminal, cultural, and psychological landscape of organized crime around the globe. Lucky Luciano's life ended in 1962, leaving behind a complex legacy of power, strategy, and influence. Though exiled and physically distant from his empire, his systems, alliances, and reputation endured, showing his mastery over human behavior and organizational control. He transformed chaotic gangs into a disciplined, professional network, balancing fear, loyalty, and psychological influence to maintain authority. His creation of the Commission, cross-ethnic alliances, and structured operations revolutionized organized crime and established a model emulated worldwide. Luciano's life illustrates the duality of power, its potential for dominance and its inherent vulnerability, and cements him as both a historical figure and a symbol of strategic leadership in the criminal world.